venture capital is changing rapidly. The last decade has seen more change in venture capital than, I would argue, the 4 decades or 5 decades that venture capital has existed. In other words, more change. And we're going to go through some of those changes, how it affects the entrepreneur, how it affects the investor. Chamath was nice enough to put a deck together.
And then I guess, Jason, we'll figure out a way to post this into the YouTube or something like that. And
yeah, you know what? We'll put in the show notes a link to this Google presentation, and Nick can pull up the slides when we're talking about them.
I think if folks can give us feedback, this is kind of a new thing for us. We're trying to experiment, which is sort of, this is like a half teach-in, half discussion on something we all wanted to talk about. And hopefully you guys get some value from it, but tell us if it's not. So I want to thank Carmen Collins on my team who helped put this together. But let me just go through this state of venture capital. So a couple of high-level points. There's like some really important trends at play. The first is that there really is now underneath a massive change in the players in this game. Founder demographics are changing slowly but surely. We're going to go into that in a second. Traditional VC investors are getting disrupted. We're going to go into that. And then this model, which I love, of let me know how I can be helpful, quote unquote, basically eroding and ceding ground to what we call solo capitalists. And we'll talk about that, which is probably the most disruptive trend in venture. Second, we'll talk about the inflation in the amount of money that's going into these companies, which really means more money at higher prices, and why that's good in some ways and actually bad in some other ways. This goes back to David's point of, not being forced to generate milestones sooner. And then the third is that it's really now a founder's market. And I think this is really important because, you've seen an enormous amount of dilution and lack of control for founders and employee teams in companies. And I think that there are some really disruptive new ways that completely usurp traditional venture, non-dilutive forms of financing. We'll talk about that. So let me just level set for you guys. I asked the following question: what are the demographics of the United States? And here's what they are. In the United States today, 59.7% of people are white, non-Hispanic. 12.5% are Black. 5.8% are Asian. 18.7% are Hispanic, and 2.3% are multi-race. If you map that to VC founders, 77% of VC founders are white. 1% are Black. 17.7% are Asian, 1.8% are Hispanic, and 2.5% are multi-race. So amongst multi-race, Asian, and white, you either are at or over-indexing your representative population, and Blacks and Hispanics, this is not anything new, but massively underrepresented. If you take it from a gender, females have lower representation among founders, but it's growing. So the US is basically 50-50 male-female. Female-founded companies were 23% of all deal activity in 2019. That's pretty good, up from 12% in 2010. Although racial diversity is still pretty lacking, which we know. And then the young tech bro stereotype is cracking, this is incredible. A 2019 study in the Times showed that the average age of a tech founder is, David Sachs, what do you think it is? The average age of a tech founder in
median or average? Mean or median?
Average.
Well, I saw your deck, so isn't it something like, it was surprisingly
35, 40?
42.
Yeah. No, I'm seeing a lot. I think, I don't know, just to pause here for a moment, what do we think?
I can still found a company.
You can. Yeah. What do we think is, given you had the longevity question earlier, and then you have people, generating wealth and starting companies in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, who then underwrite it themselves, right? Until they get to product market fit and then raise money. What do we think is the best zone for an entrepreneur in terms of having a great outcome?
I've always thought that how old was I? I was 31, 32 when I started Social Capital. This is a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. I feel like I'm reasonably successful at it. But I was preparing for the first 13 or 14 years of my professional career. I learned some good things. I learned some bad things. I learned tactics that worked. I learned strategies that didn't work.
So 30s or 40s or 30s to 50s?
Yeah. In my experience, for me, and I think it's personal for everybody, I was best positioned to know what to do and at least iterate in my 30s. And I think in the absence of an idea that has some network effect or something that's sort of like supernatural outside of your own control, I think the older you are, generally, probably the better prepared you'll be.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I did PayPal when I was still in my 20s, but I wasn't the founder of the company. I was recruited to it at a very early stage. I didn't really start Yammer until, well, I guess I started the predecessor company, Genie, when I was 34. And then Yammer pivoted into Yammer when I was 35. I mean,
absolutely.
That's like a good level of preparation, you know? Unless you have a spectacular idea for a startup, you should probably get some experience first.
100%. Freeberg, any thoughts there? On what's the kill zone, best time to launch companies in your mind, or investing companies, or where founders are peaking?
Look, everyone's got their own path. You know, I mean, Zuck and Sergey and Larry and Bill Gates, they started right out of college without any experience. But I mean, I had 2 jobs in tech before I started my first company in 2006.
Yeah.
And so I had a lot to draw from, and that really informed me. But I think everyone's different. I mean, some people.
If you have the idea, by all means, do it in your 20s. You know,
absolutely.
But
I mean, by far the greatest kind of like measure of whether and when you're kind of prepared for this is your ability to continue learning. You know, continuous learning to me is one of the greatest predictors of entrepreneurial success. And all the guys that have lasted for decades, from Bezos to Zuck to, you know, Larry and Sergey, you know, they were continuously evolving themselves because they were continuous learners. Bill Gates is the penultimate example of this, right? I mean, this guy's reinvented himself 1,000 times.
That what you said is so important. I'm going to change my answer. I think I started Social Capital when I was actually the most able to get out of my own way and learn continuously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, one thing I'd add to this is it's so much easier to be a founder now today than, I mean, look, I remember I joined PayPal in 1999. That was my first startup. It was like really hard to get into entrepreneurship in the 1990s. You know, the VCs had tremendous power and control. They would routinely replace founder CEOs. You know, everyone had to go to Sand Hill Road to get capital. It was hard to even know how to network your way to Sand Hill Road. It was just much, much harder to be a founder. It was much harder to raise money. It was hard to know what to do. And then I think actually one of the things that really changed things was with blogging emerging in the mid 2000s, it led to a proliferation of information where now, you know, other founders started blogging, investors started blogging, and there became a wealth of information out there so you could learn how to do it. And then, of course, you had incubators and so on, like YC. So there became more of like a playbook for just like how you actually get a company off the ground. When I graduated in law school, which was 1998, I knew I wanted to get into business and entrepreneurship. I really had no idea how to do it. And if it wasn't for a phone call from Peter Thiel, I'm not sure I would have gotten into it. You know, but now everybody knows what to do.
Can I ask you a question then? So let me give you a stat and I'll ask a question. What do you think that story would be, David, for somebody that wasn't a white man? So here's the data. The percentage of female VC decision makers has grown by more than 2x. What that means is about firms over $1 billion, about a quarter of them have at least 2+ female decision makers, but 61% of them have 0. And 80% of venture firms still have no Black investors. How do you correlate or intersect that idea of ease of starting a company with the pattern recognition of those folks and the inability to sort of maybe map to people with Black skin or women?
I mean, I think that what Silicon Valley and what venture capital represents is opportunity, right? And we have to extend that opportunity to as many people as possible. I mean, that's really the key here, is we do need to make it as widely available as possible.
By the way, Chamath, I mean, one way to slice things is the percentage of diverse representation within the ranks of venture and private equity. But there is a equivalent scaling in the number of venture firms and the amount of venture capital since, you know, Sachs and you and I and all of us kind of entered the technology industry kind of early 2000. And the number of firms that exist today that are kind of micro firms and scaled firms, I think presents a much larger set of opportunity. You're right. There are still standards and there are still challenges in diversity and kind of having access. But there is so much more access than there has ever been. And that's really changed the landscape. I mean, folks coming out of college can get $1 million. That was kind of unheard of back in 1999. or
the reality is like there's so many incubators. I mean, it's not as if Jason or YC or any of these folks give millions of dollars, right, Jason? Like these checks are still really small. So the point is, you can build something if you have the skills to build something.
The gap right now is that there's a lot of people who have ideas about what they want to do, but they have no skills. And I think what we found in a vibrant market like today, I mean, this is the most vibrant I've ever seen it. There's at least 3 or 4 times as many startups to choose from at the earliest stages. And what we're seeing is the number of VCs has not grown at that level. It has grown. The number of players has grown, but not at that level. Therefore, the average quality of a deal has gone up. The average quality of a funded deal has gone up, but the average quality of a startup has gone down. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the ones that get funded are better than ever, but the average is lower because there's so many doing it. And then just the best piece of advice I have is when we talked about continuous learning is if you are not building the product in some way or selling the product in some way, then what are you doing at this startup? Like you either build it or you sell it. Like there really isn't much more there. And a lot of people just have ideas and no ability to execute. You really have to be a developer, designer, UX person, marketer, something in terms of getting this product out to the world.